This video will cover section 2 of chapter 12 titled The World of Southern Whites. This video will focus on explaining the social structure of the South. To begin, we're going to talk about the group that is at the top of the structure. That group is actually divided into two groups. This plantation elite is broken down into traditional South aristocrats and upstart capitalist planters. These two groups make up what we know as the plantation elite. So let's begin talking about traditional Old South aristocrats. We just call them Old South. This group will develop wealth and has long-lasting wealth ever since even before the Revolutionary War of the 1700s. One of the things you have to look at within the Old South is the type of crops that they focus on: rice and tobacco. They are the leaders in these industries. They are located in the Chesapeake region, Maryland, Virginia, but also South Carolina and Georgia. This group developed a Republican aristocracy, which meant that they felt like they should be in power. They should be the ones in control. They should have the political power, which goes against the ideology of Andrew Jackson, who feels like everyone should be participating, especially the commoners. So the Old South was against this notion of letting everyone participate. They felt that the group should only be the one in charge. They're the one that should have that political power. They felt like the whole idea of inequality exists, is part of life, is part of the universe, and people shouldn't dwell on it. So they eventually focused on maintaining their power, maintaining their wealth. One way to do that is by marrying each other's children and assuring that their power, their wealth remain within the families of power. These individuals will eventually be, broken down into other or venture out into other professions like being merchants, lawyers, newspaper editors, ministers. This group was very into displaying um, their wealth, right? They're very living a very luxurious life, a very extravagant life. This iconic view, right, of southern plantations, a long road with overarching trees, and at the end of that road, this fancy, good-looking mansion. And so that was very typical of this old South, especially in South Carolina. These rice growers were very wealthy. So the within the group of the Old South, they even themselves are broken down into two groups. The rice growers, who eventually made huge profits, even when they were challenged by Asian rice that entered the market. They offset that challenge by selling their slaves, and then whatever slaves they had, they worked them harder. And one of the things that you see is that with that wealth, they were able to buy mansions and throw parties and just uh, demonstrate, display the wealth that they had. And again, the whole idea was to display, and so a lot of them really put money into their homes, these mansions, not just looking good from the outside, but also all the stuff from the inside was also extravagant. The second group within the Old South are the tobacco growers. These individuals eventually venture off into other jobs, like I mentioned, ministers, doctors, lawyers, mainly because tobacco actually takes a hit in terms of profits. They are affected by the American Revolution, the War of 1812, because Europeans eventually start to look to a different source to supply their tobacco need. But even though they take a hit, they eventually supplement that loss of profit by taking on other jobs. And again, they made some profit by selling their slaves or renting their slaves. When we look at all the crops in the South, the major crops: sugar cane, tobacco, corn, and rice. Tobacco is the easiest to grow, less labor, and that's why in section one we talked about this growth of the growth of slaves, slave populations in the upper South, in the Chesapeake region, mainly because they were not stressed. Life was not hard in comparison to other parts of the South. The other group at the top of the structure are the upstart capitalists. These are the plantation owners that left the upper South and moved to the Southwest to develop cotton and eventually reap the profits from cotton. They eventually are going to be in the deep South, typically Texas, Alabama, Mississippi. They are really going to exploit their slaves. They really live a harsh life. And that's why most slaves that are heading to the South are going to resist. So, a way that the Southerners are going to try to break up this resistance is by incorporating religion. But before incorporating religion, we have to talk about how they defended this institution of slavery. Uh, According to Thomas Jefferson, he felt that slaves, it's a misfortune, that it's a necessary evil that needs to happen. But the Southerners of this time are going to disagree with Thomas Jefferson and call it a positive good. They actually feel like they're doing a good thing for slaves. James Henry Hammond, who believes that he has slaves, but he takes care of them, unlike the North that has salary laborers, and they don't take care of them. So that the idea is that Southerners really defended the institution of slavery. They felt like they were doing a good, and like I said, they're going to incorporate church as a way as pacifying the masses. They eventually will build a church on their land. They encourage to participate in Sunday church services, and even at times when they had slaves that could read and from the Bible and could eventually become preachers for the masses, and in a way kind of pacify them and say, you know what, the Bible says you must obey your master and you must do your duty as a slave. And so that's something that whites eventually used to control the slaves and possible slave rebellions. Another way that Deep South planters organized themselves was by incorporating the gang labor system. And we'll talk more about this when we get to the Reconstruction, but just you need to know that it's a group that goes and works and completes jobs. You have several groups led by a black supervisor, but all the groups are eventually led by one white overseer. And again, these individuals were really productive because they were literally they had somebody on them to work, and so that's something that is part of the gang labor system. So again, this deep red is what we call the con belt or the black belt, and then the pink areas that where con eventually expanded to, and like I said, you will have plantation owners used religion to control the slaves. And slaves took this religion, meshed it with their own folklore, and then created this African American culture. If you had a slave that could read, he could even be lent and rented to other plantations to put down any kind of rebellion. And again, that's part of the white southerner using his resources to maintain the peace at their plantation. Capitalists, their focus is cotton. They are going to grow cotton. That's where the biggest profit is of all the crops. That's where the one that profits the most. And so you're going to see that a lot of them are going to go into the Southwest to eventually create a profit for themselves. So let's look at the structure. At the top, you have the planter elites, like I mentioned. You have them being 5% of the population. They own 50% of the slaves and they produce 50% of cotton. They themselves, like I mentioned, are the top of the top. and they are going to make huge profits from cotton, like I said. The second group, the middling planters, they are 20% of the population. They own 6 to 20 slaves. They own 40% of the slaves. So in combination with the planter elites, they literally control 90% of the slaves. They produce 30% of the cotton. So with the planter elites, they literally produce 80% of the cotton that the United States produces. Below them are going to be the smallholding planters, the yeomen. These guys are really struggling. They're just trying to survive. They own 1 to 5 slaves. They work alongside their slaves, and literally their entire life, from the time they became yeomen to the time they died, they will always work the land, and that's part of who they are. They are going to eventually, because of hard times, struggles, if 40% of them will eventually become tenant farmers, which basically means they rent the farm, they don't own the land. And the idea is that this group really struggles. They don't live that luxury life. They just basically live a work to survive, nothing more. There's no profit really into it. And as you see the different three groups, right? These are groups that are part of the slave owning society. You have those who are at the top, middle, and then at the bottom. And looking at this pie graph, you can see that even though people believe that most of the South or most of Southerners own slaves, that's not the truth. You can see that the majority of the South or Southerners did not own slaves, only a fraction of them. And then at the bottom of the class, you have the southern whites, the poor whites. These individuals really had no way of improving their lives, no social mobility available for them, no opportunities, mainly because one, there is no institution for education. So let's say if they wanted to get educated and go search a profession, they couldn't because there was no schools. They're not going to be able to work because plantation owners are not going to hire them, pay them a salary when they can have slaves work for them. And even in the occasion where they wanted to, maybe they had a little money saved up and they want to invest that into buying a slave and some land, they would always be outbid by the big plantation owners. They would go show up to these auctions, they would bid on this slave, but eventually the plantation owner would outbid them because they had more resources. Um, they when talking about the poor whites, they were really poor, not just in material stuff. They were poor in education and they were poor in morality. For them, really, the satisfaction in life was that at least they were better than the blacks, the African Americans, the slaves. That's what made their day. That they could feel like, oh, at least I'm not a black in Southern society. But eventually, this group you will look for better opportunities. They eventually have to leave the deep south. They eventually end up either in the Appalachian Mountains or in Missouri in the Midwest, looking for an opportunity to buy land, so they could eventually grow and develop the land, so they could eventually give some kind of land to their children. And so that's one of the things that you'll see is that they work hard, they move to other places, they migrate to other places to be able to provide a better life their for their children. And who makes up this group? A big part of this group of the poor whites are going to be these immigrants from Germany, from Ireland. They come here with the hopes of creating a dream, of accomplishing a dream, of owning land and maybe giving land to their kids. And again, the group is really the Southern whites just. The poor whites just didn't have the opportunities, the education, the resources to move up in life.